All right, hello. Again, my name is McKenna Douglaa, and this past year I performed my research under my mentor, Dr. Kreinath of the Department of Anthropology, and I would just like to thank Dr. Ranfadtel for inspiring me to take on this research. And as you can see, my research pertains to looking at ancient female deities or goddesses in the ancient Near East. So to start off with the framework of my research, I want to read this quote by American archaeologist William Dever. "The men who wrote the Bible created God in their own male image. The imagery is male, the language is male, but why should it be? If God can be the father, why not the mother?" So this got me thinking with looking back to the biblical source of Genesis, where it talks about God creating mankind or humankind in his own image, male and female, to reflect equal characteristics of masculine and feminine. So if they had been passed on, those characteristics, those had to come from the maker, having masculine and feminine characteristics. So with my research purpose, I wanted to look at the feminine characteristics, particularly with goddesses and religion, and look at those goddesses who are typically a consort or kind of like a sidekick to the chief male god. So with the framework of my research, I took an anthropological approach, doing a critical textual analysis of myths and stories and archaeological evidence from the ancient Near East. So I wanted to look at the roles and how gender was used of these goddesses in these myths. And the neighboring religions that I looked at in the ancient Near East are the Israelite, Canaanite, Ugaritic, Sumerian, Akkadian, and Hittite. So the topics that I want to touch on for today are three goddesses: Ashura, Anat, Ishtar, and finally the idea of a mother goddess in these neighboring areas. So to give you a map for reference of the area that I'm talking about, up top in what we know as modern-day Turkey, we have the Hittites. Going down, we have Ugarit, Israel, Canaan. Off to the side, we have Akkad and Sumer. So you can see how they're all kind of neighbors in these spheres. So the first goddess, Ashura, she's found in Ugaritic texts from 1000 BCE. And she's discussed as being this mother goddess. She's called Lady Ashura of the Sea, where she's described as being gentle in her nature. She's the consort of El, the chief male god. She is the queen mother of all the other gods in their cosmos. And interestingly enough, in Israelite customs, she's described as Yahweh's consort. Now, if you're familiar with biblical or Israelite religion, Yahweh is another name for the Lord or God. So she's described as having these kind and motherly characteristics. And in archaeological evidence, we have found in northeastern Sinai the Kuntila Arjud. So that's right up there on the far right side with the funny little figures. At the very top, there's an inscription that reads Yahweh and his Ashura. Now, this is interesting because when we think of our typical Christian religion, we're thinking of this prominent male masculine god. So the idea of Yahweh or God and his Ashura, a female consort or possibly a feminine side, kind of breaks open some barriers. Now down on the far right side, you can see some little figurines. Those are figurines of Ashura. These were very popular in the region, and they were kind of like a little totem or a little symbol that you carried around with you or had in your household. So that second goddess I wanted to touch on is Anat. She is found in Ugaritic myths from 1400 to 1500 BCE. And in the Akkad epic, she's described as this virgin warrior goddess. She's associated with love and fertility. And she's a little bit temperamental and violent, so she's not afraid to lash out. And interestingly, she is an androgynous character, so she switches between gender roles. And in the Akkad epic, she is promised this special bow by the chief god El. And when she doesn't get that bow, and it's given to a human, She does what she has to get that bow, and she seduces him, she bullies him, and eventually has him killed to get him out of the way so she can get her precious bow. Now, in the Baal cycle, her characteristics are a little different. She's described as being more motherly and yearning after her lover after he's swallowed. And later on in the story, she brings out her warrior goddess side. She goes into battle with her troops and is named the Lady of the Mountain, and she is entrenched in the blood and the gore of the enemy, so she's not afraid to get her hands dirty. So the third goddess I wanted to touch on is Ishtar. She's found in a variety of these regions in the ancient Near East. And in the legend of Sargon and the Apology of Hattusilis III, she's described as being this motherly character who gives divine aid to those who she cares about. In the Akkadian myth of Gilgamesh, she falls in love at first sight with a human, Gilgamesh, after he returns from a quest. And having fallen in love with him, she offers herself. He spurns her, which was not a good idea on his part, and she has him killed similarly to how Anat had that other man killed to get him out of the way. So some of her characteristics are fertility and sex, life and death, violence and storms, aggression, ambiguity, and passion. Now, similarly to Anat, she's also androgynous in her characteristics. So she has that masculine and that feminine side. In one of the hymns, she's described as being this illustrious goddess who's beautiful, but at the same time, she's described as being bearded with a beard. Now, this is kind of an old way to say this lady has balls. An interesting parallel to our first goddess, Ashura, is she's described as the mistress of heaven, whereas in biblical sources, Ashura is termed the queen of heaven, so that's just an interesting little connection there. So lastly, we looked at these three goddesses, and we can see from the similarities and the differences show a broad spectrum of emotions that these goddesses portray, from being this loving, motherly figure to being more of like the mother bear who will do what she needs to do. And with these similarities, they typically fall into the role of being a consort to a chief god in their cosmos. They're a queen mother. They're associated with life and death, and love and fertility. So they have that motherly, life-giving power, but they're not afraid to take it away at the same time. So kind of like the idea of what my mom tells me is, I brought you into this world, not afraid to take you out. So going back to these three goddesses, it brought me to this idea of coalescing into one mother goddess who kind of covers this whole area of the ancient Near East. So there's this reoccurring idea of a mother goddess in these different neighboring religions. So lastly, we don't hear a whole lot about this goddess. So what exactly happened to her? Well, as religion has changed over time from the beginnings, literacy had a big impact on it, especially in the presence of the goddess and what people know about her. So with traditional religions of what we think to be pagan, it's more operating towards using the use of symbols and images and closeness to nature, whereas literacy came into play, scrolls and religious texts and logical thinking and use of abstract knowledge shifted into more masculine principles, so going from feminine to masculine. And over time, this allowed the patriarchal culture to develop and kind of suppress the idea of a goddess. A big example of how this took place with the Israelite religion is the Ten Commandments. So if you're familiar with the first commandment, that says there can be one God only, so this masculine male, and there's zero tolerance for the idea of a goddess or even just a feminine side of the god. So you can see there's that shift from the nature images towards more of a faceless, abstract idea of Yahweh or God. So In conclusion, this research only scratches the surface of this topic, and it acknowledges from the early beginnings of religion, feminine characteristics have been there all along. So we usually are familiar with the Deuteronomistic framework of this idea of God or Yahweh in Christian religion being this masculine male and not necessarily having a feminine side. So with my research, I wanted to look at his consort or his feminine side and explore that a little bit through comparing the ancient Near Eastern religions with those goddesses. So what's interesting, though, is in biblical sources, there are examples of God or Yahweh having a feminine side, but this isn't discussed so much. In Isaiah, God is described as a comforting mother who rebukes with flames of fire. So you can see there's that mother bear idea, doing what he or she needs to do. So in human understanding, God may be described as a man or a woman according to gender ideals, but maybe has more genders all along. So here are my references, and I will take any questions.
I really found your topic interesting. Why do you think there's been such a resistance of, especially in mainstream Christianity, with even exploring the idea that there could be a God the Mother, or that God could have a consort? Because I go to a church that believes in both God the Father and God the Mother, and when I tell people, I get a lot of oh my God, you're not a Christian, but history has obviously shown that there's been some evidence of the female existence of God, and there's multiple Bible verses. So do you think it's more of a threat to patriarchal power that has often been associated with, Christianity, especially white male Christians, or just a lack of understanding?
Definitely. A big portion of the research that I looked into was that Deuteronomistic idea. So that stems from looking at that first commandment, that there can be one God only. And with the writers of the Bible, looking at it critically, it was human writing. So we're looking at how they interpreted the idea. And with a lot of the sources of Ashura, she's mentioned in the Bible a lot, but that's because they talk about getting rid of her, saying that she's bad. We have to destroy any evidence of her so we can make way for this specific idea that the men that were writing about this were trying to get out there. Yeah.
So I know this is a little bit off from where you were going. So you looked at a particular region and a particular period of history. Have you started looking into more recent or more widespread, so Hindu goddesses and androgynous gods, or Gaians and Wiccans, or the other sorts of religions in this ballpark that have a stronger female aspect to them?
I did kind of go down a rabbit hole during my research and came across the Hindu gods and how they're very androgynous, and just found that very interesting. So that is definitely a different direction I would like to take further on, because this is a very specific region, and it goes out through all space and time. So I would love to look at other areas as well. Thank you. Yeah.
What amazes me in the very beginning in Genesis, the Bible is, we're told to take the Bible as it is, and one of the very first things that God states is, "Let us make man in our image." Mm-hmm. And lots of times people, I've noticed different churches or beliefs, they kind of can twist it to where they think that God is talking to Jesus. Well, he didn't create two men. He did create, what was created was a male and a female figure. Yes. So when I read, even as a child, when it told me let us, he's talking to somebody else, right? Create, man and woman or whatever in our image. To me, that kind of gives me the hint that they created a man and a woman, so it must have been the bride of Christ. And do you know how many times in the Bible that it is mentioned that there is a bride of Christ, that there is a mother, a woman?
Right.
And did you happen to pick that up as to how many times?
I don't have an exact count, but yes, very, very familiar with that reoccurring mentioning of it.
It's mentioned quite a bit, yes.
I'm really glad that you asked that because one of the interesting things in biblical texts is there's that talk about us or our, and you're just like, okay, who else are we talking about? And it's not exactly defined for us. It's kind of like one of those things left up into interpretation. And I've had this discussion quite a few times, like who's there? Who also is there?
In Revelations, in the end of Revelations, that is when she's really introduced, and it also states that she is our mother. I mean, it just comes straight out and tells you she is our mother.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.